So last week I started preparing the Palomino camper here for its first trip of the season. But when I went to lift up the roof, this lift motor here would only lift the roof about that far before giving out. I've always had trouble with this particular lift motor here, basically since I bought the camper. And I've been online before to try to see how to replace the motor. It wasn't super obvious to me initially, but there really wasn't a lot of information out there. Eventually I was able to replace the motor, and more importantly, I did some maintenance to the lift arm, which I think is a contributing factor. But there's some other factors at play as well. So I thought I'd go ahead and make a video on what I think is causing these motors to fail and the lift system as a whole. And I'm going to replace the second one. I'm going to replace the one on the corner there, and I'll take you through the process and show you what I think is the best way to fix these. So the first thing to note is there have been several different roof lift motor designs on this camper over the last few years. Now originally they used to have the lift motors on the inside of the camper, which I think is not a bad idea. That keeps everything out of the elements and probably resolves one of the biggest issues that people are having with respect to water ingress and things like that. But more recently they have at least two designs that I'm aware of. There's this one where the motor and the lift arm are two separate units, but there's another design as well where the lift motor and the lift arm are basically one complete unit. Now, to my knowledge, both have been problematic, or at least I've seen a lot of complaints online about both systems, and I can only show you how to replace or repair this one because that's the only one that I have. So something else I thought I'd point out is that you have two sockets here on every corner, and they look the same, but they're a bit different. So this top one is meant for the lift motors, the roof lift motors, and it's connected to the auxiliary output of the motor controller, which is just inside the camper here. And this bottom one here is actually meant for the electric lift jacks. Now I don't have electric jacks, I just use these mechanical units at the moment. So that means that my bottom socket was open and free. And I switched over from using the top one to the bottom one. And here's why. When I got the camper, basically when I would go to lift the roof, anytime it encountered any kind of resistance, or if the lift arms were not thoroughly lubricated, it would blow a 30 amp fuse. And what I came to find out is that this auxiliary circuit actually has only two 30 amp fuses feeding 4 lift motors, whereas the bottom one here, the one that's meant for the lift jacks, uses 4 30 amp fuses for 4 motors. And so I was much less likely to blow a fuse using this bottom socket. And in fact, since I switched over, I haven't blown any fuses at all. Now I talked to a technician over at the dealer where I bought the camper, and he disagreed with me. He kept telling me that there are 4 fuses feeding the auxiliary output, but I'm telling you there's only 2. So I don't know if mine was built wrong or differently than some of the older models, or if they're all like that. All I can tell you is that switching over to this bottom socket has solved my problem with blowing fuses. Now also to switch over with the remote is very easy. You just hold in this little select button here until you get this little LED flashing, and that'll allow you to switch the remote between the top socket and the bottom socket. So after replacing the dead motor that was on the front left, everything's working fine. I'm able to raise and lower the roof without any issue, but this back one here on the left side is making a bit of noise. Let me get the microphone up next to it. Maybe you can tell. That's not nearly as smooth as the other 3. It almost sounds like there's sand in the gears or something like that. The motor's still working, but I think maybe the gears need to be cleaned out and lubricated. But at any rate, when I bought the replacement motor for the one on the front, I went ahead and bought 3 more motors, so 4 total, 2 for the left side and 2 for the right side, because the motors weren't all that expensive, and I just wanted to make sure I had one on hand in case another one fails. But because I'm going to have to take this one apart to look at the gears, I thought I'd go ahead and replace the motor while I'm at it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and I'll show you the process. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is remove this plastic cover here. And I thought while I'm doing this, I would just use the tools that I have on board that I keep here in the truck or in the camper. That way I'll know for sure if I need to do this out in the field, if I have all the tools necessary. So first thing I need is just a number 2 Phillips. You have a screw on this side and a screw on this side. And note that the one on this side is screwing into metal. It's screwing into this lift arm here, which means that the threads are fine threads. It's a machine screw. whereas the screw over here is just screwing into plastic, and they're not fine threads. So you want to note that, because if you get these backwards, you may damage the threads when you go to put this cover back on. Okay, and that exposes the motor. Okay, so before I can remove the motor, I'm going to have to disconnect the electrical connectors up here. And I want to make sure that one of them at least is marked so that I don't get the connectors backwards when I go to put it back together. So I have a bit of red tape here, and I'm just going to put the red tape on this one so that I can remember the red tape is next to the camper. Okay, so something you may notice is that there's a bit of oxidation on these connectors, which is not surprising. There's no weatherproofing really here, not even on the copper. These are just cheap crimp style connectors. So I'm going to address that first. I'm going to go ahead and take off this wire and unplug it from the socket and seal these up and clean them up a bit. Okay, so I have some electronic cleaner here and just a little brush. I'm going to go ahead and get the oxidation off of here while I'm working on this. Okay, so what I have here is some marine grade heat shrink tubing, which means that when you hit it with heat, it's going to shrink around the wire. And there's also some adhesive on the inside, which will melt and help to seal everything up so that it's basically waterproof. Now, basically what I want to do is I want to get this around the connector so that the adhesive will seal out the copper on the end. So about like that. So all I need to do now is just hit it with the heat gun, and that should shrink up and seal. Okay, I don't know how well it shows up on camera, but I have some sealant there just where I wanted it, sort of sealing the copper. So hopefully that copper wire will not corrode any further. And of course you can see there's a sealant all the way around this side as well. So moisture is not going to get in there and damage the connector. So I just need to do the same with the other one, and then we'll go to the next step. Okay, and here I just have a piece of standard heat shrink tubing. This is not the marine grade. There's no adhesive inside. I'm going to use it to protect the end of the connector like this, so it'll be sealed from any moisture. Now the reason I'm just using the standard heat shrink tubing is I don't want the adhesive getting into the slots here, because if that happens, then it's not going to be able to fit back over the blade. Okay, these are sealed pretty well now. And the only other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of silicone grease to the inside here, and a little bit to the blade as well on the camper. This is this stuff here, bulb grease, and that'll help to protect the metal from any further oxidation. Okay, so we're back here on the camper, and I need to take off the motor and lift arm assembly. And to do that, I'm going to start with this bolt here. This is a 5/32 hex bolt. You may be able to find a metric equivalent to that, I don't know. And then over here is this nut. I'm not sure what size the nut is because I don't carry any wrenches in my truck. What I do have is a 5/32 hex bit. I don't carry any hex wrenches, but just this bit here, and then a standard crescent wrench. Okay, so you want to pay attention to the way this spacer is set up here. There's this little U-bracket, and then there's a spacer here on the left side, so you're going to put that back in the same way when you reattach it. And because this is held up at the top and there's also a screw on the side, I can go ahead and take this out without any repercussions. So when I replace the first motor, I just use a standard 8-foot ladder. So I'm going to try it with this little step ladder. This is a ladder that I bring with me. That way I'll know if I have everything that I need to do this job when I'm camping. So all the way up here to the top of the lift arm, you have this little pin here, and this is going to need to come off. So I need to remove this little clip first. And then the pin comes out. And the only thing left holding the motor in place now is this one little Phillips screw. Okay, so it should come right out now. And there we go. Okay, so I have the assembly on my bench here. There are a couple things to note. So First of all, there's this white powdery substance here on the lift arm. That's because last week when I was preparing the camper, I sprayed it down with this dry lube with Teflon. And I do that every year. That helps to prevent the lift arm from hanging up on the metal sleeve that goes around it. These things are kind of loosey-goosey, and that has a tendency to hit the sleeve, and lubricating it helps with that. I've had that problem in the past. The other thing to notice is that you can kind of see how this works now. So the motor turns this little rod, threaded rod, and that lifts the lift rod up or down. And you can see this is spinning very freely. Now this is spinning much more freely than the motor I replaced. And something to note here is that this rod is wet. And again, when I was preparing the camper last week, I was noticing this thing was really noisy. And I thought that maybe I was getting some oxidation or rust on this rod here. So what I did is I took off the end cap. And I did this while it was on the camper. I just took out that pin there and I popped this off with a screwdriver. And I used some of this. This is just standard penetrating oil. And I just doused the inside of this lift arm with the penetrating oil to hopefully dissolve any rust. So it's been dissolving for the last week or so. And as you can see, it's moving very freely. So that noise I was hearing is not related to this lift rod. I'm thinking that it's probably the gear inside of the motor housing there. Okay, so I've unthreaded the lift arm all the way to the end. And hopefully you can see here, this is pretty clean. I think the penetrating oil is doing its job. I can see some dissolved rust in there a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and clean off any remaining rust off of this threaded rod. And I'm going to use some standard grease. That penetrating oil is working great, but it'll dissipate after some time. I think the grease will do a lot better in terms of protecting this from any moisture or dirt and debris. So that brings me to one of the design flaws, in my personal opinion, of this system. And that is this end cap here is not sealed. And so when it's outside and you get any rain at all, that water is going to go into the lift arm, and it's going to settle down in here and get along the threaded rod and eventually rust it out and or oxidize it, and that's going to cause a problem with the threading motion there. So that's one of the problems. I'm going to go ahead and address it with some grease. Now, if you notice over here is a little pin on the end of this rod. That's just a little stop pin so that the lift arm cannot go back any further when you put down the top. So I'm really happy with the way this rod turned out. It's looking really clean now. I don't see any rust, so that's good. I'm going to go ahead and start greasing it up a bit. Okay, so I have the original motor and two brand new ones sitting next to it because I wanted to demonstrate something here. So if you'll notice, they're all in the same orientation with the connector on the left-hand side. But notice the gearbox. So you have this little bump up here, and the one next to it is exactly the same. If I come over here, that little bump is on the bottom side. So this is a left-hand motor, so this came off the left-hand side of the camper. This is a left-hand motor. This is a right-hand motor. So when you go to buy a new one, make sure you're getting the right one. You want to match it to the bad one. You don't want to get the wrong one because these are non-refundable. So you buy it, that's it. You're not going to be able to return it for a replacement. Now they do come with this little diagram here that shows you the different components that make up the motor and the gearbox. And it comes with this little tube of grease for the gearbox. And then this little disc here, this came in the same bag. This is called a thrust disc, and it goes into the gearbox. I'll show you that in a little bit once I take these apart. Okay, so next I need to remove these two little bolts here, and these are 1/4 inch. So I'm going to go ahead and take these off. Okay, let's take this off. Okay, there we go. So you can see it's wet in there, but also rusty. and fairly dirty. So there's that little thrust disc I was talking about right there. Okay, so now I need to just take this off, this little gear here, and I'll swap over to the new motor. It just pops right out. And I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a bit, and then I'll get the new motor installed. So looking into the old motor and the gearbox here, I'm seeing a lot of debris and rust residue, and I think these are actually water droplets down in here. And if I turn it to the side and take out this little worm gear, I'm seeing quite a bit of rust on this worm gear as well. And more importantly, there's no grease to be found anywhere. And I think that's the primary problem with this system. Again, in my personal opinion, I think this is a flawed system. As you can see, there's a lot of water here on the side of the motor. There's no seal on this gearbox here. And the only things protecting this motor assembly from water is the plastic shroud that we took off earlier. But that plastic shroud has a big gap at the top, and that just allows water to get all over the place. And of course, water gets into here from the lift arm there. So this is really not designed, this motor assembly, in my opinion, is not designed to be in an outdoor application. If I look at the other motors that are very similar to this from the same manufacturer on their website, those motors are all going into indoor applications. So they're in things like seat adjusters. Again, that's an indoor application. There's one that lifts or lowers a television set. Again, that's an indoor application. So, there's no rubber O-ring or seal or gasket, on this little gearbox here. And of course, water is going to get into it because it's outside and there's nothing really protecting it. So that is one of the primary issues with this setup, I think. This is really not designed to be outside, and you get a lot of rust down in here or on the little threaded rod inside the lift arm there, and that just makes a mess of everything. It causes a lot of friction, which then overheats the motor and kills the motor. So I think that's what's going on here with these, and I'm not sure what the permanent solution is other than just making sure you're doing routine maintenance on these and taking them apart once in a while, making sure there's plenty of grease in here. Now I will keep this motor because it was working. It was noisy, but I'm going to clean this up and re-grease the little gearbox here and put it back together, and I'll keep it inside my camper in case another one of those new motors goes out at some point in the future. I'll have a spare, and I'll do the same for the right side. So I'll keep one left and one right inside the camper at all times, just in case. Well, I remember that I carry the spit driver in my truck, and that's going to make it a lot easier to remove these two 1/4-inch screws here. And I was able to confirm that I do basically carry everything in my truck that I would need to replace one of these motors out in the field. But if you have a failure and you don't have a spare, or maybe you're missing some of the tools that you would need, you can actually turn these motors manually, assuming that the gears are not seized up or something like that. On this side of the motor, there's a little socket. It's hard to see down in there, but there's a little square socket, and you'll need a square bit like this in order to turn it. Now I have two here because initially I bought this one from Milwaukee. It's labeled SQ2, so it's a square number 2 bit, and I found that it's just slightly too large. It fit one or two of the motors, but it was very tight. The other motors, it didn't fit at all. So I bought a second one. So this one is from Bosch, and it's labeled R2. I don't know if there's a difference between SQ2 and R2, but this one I found fit all my motors, and this one works really well. So just a word to the wise, make sure that before you go out to the field that you test your bit to make sure it's actually working. Now I'll mention something else, and that is it takes a lot of turns on the motor here when you're turning this manually to get any movement at all up on the roof. So if you're going to do this, you probably want to carry a cordless drill with you. Okay, so let's get this gearbox disassembled here. Okay, so a couple of things to note about this gearbox and reassembly. So first of all, you'll see this worm gear here. The last time I took one of these apart, the worm gear came out along with the cover here, and that's not a big deal. There's a little square rod there, right in there, and that just, the worm gear just fits over that. But if this does come out, note that there's a little washer, a little hard to see there, but there's a little washer right here. You want to make sure that washer goes back into place before you get the worm gear put back in. Also, over here on the end of the threaded rod, there are two little washers right here, right next to the gear. So you want to make sure those are butted up against the gear here. Those are going to go inside the gearbox. You don't want those up in this area here. And then here's the thrust disc that I mentioned before, and it's going to sit right in there on the end. Once I get grease on it, it'll stick better. But the purpose of this little disc, it's kind of an important piece there. So when this lift arm is in its vertical position, there's a little ball, little tiny ball on this end here, which will be sitting on top of this disc. And so when this gear is rotating, that little ball is going to be rotating on top of the disc. So this is a pretty important piece, and you want to make sure that you've lubricated this as well. Okay, so the instructions say to lubricate the gearbox completely. So that's what I plan to do. I have the included grease here. Anyway, I think the easiest way to do this is to lubricate the gears first, and then I'll lubricate the gearbox as best as I can. Don't forget the little ball on the end, and these threads up here as well. This will help to protect the unit from rust. Because you know water is going to be all up in here. I'm going to take out this little worm gear and lubricate it as well. Okay, so that goes back in. Okay, I'm on to my second bottle now. I used the first one on the first motor that I replaced. So they give you plenty of grease. I'm just going to fill it up that way, and I think some of this is probably going to come out once I put everything together. Okay, so assembly is quite easy actually. This just slots right in there. And then the thrust disc goes in here. And that's pretty much it. Now I just need to get the cover back on. I'm not too concerned about having too much grease here based on what I saw when I disassembled the motor. I mean, there was basically no grease left. Then we just need to get these two little screws back in place. Make sure you don't over torque these because these screws are just going into plastic. Okay, so let's see if this motor is any quieter now than it was before. Okay, I don't know if you can tell through the video, but I can tell with my ears this is much quieter, and I no longer hear that crunchy sound like sand in the gears, so I think this issue has been fixed. Okay, so I have the lift actuators on the left-hand side of the camper all sorted out. I've decided to go ahead and repeat the process here on the right-hand side, just as a preventative measure, and I'll keep the old motors for spares. Now, this camper is not very old. This is just my second year of ownership, and I bought the camper new, so it didn't take very long before rust started to set in on the lift motor components. And I think that's because there's no seals anywhere in the system, and once water gets in, rust starts to form pretty quickly. So if you don't want to blow those 30 amp fuses or burn out your motors too soon, I would really suggest you make sure that the lift arms, those threaded rods, and the little motor gearbox is lubricated properly. And you also probably want to do an inspection, I would say maybe once a year or so, just to make sure that lubrication is holding up. So that's about all I have for this video. I hope that it was informative, and we'll see you next time.